cartographer.
Yeah, I have no idea. C
Yeah.
says,
C says maps are like language. They can be manipulated in order to mislead. Okay. That most people are not generally misled by words, however, should not lead us to think that most people are not susceptible to being misled by maps. Most people are taught to be cautious interpreters of language, but education in the sophisticated use of maps is almost non-existent. Which of the following most accurately describes how the statement that most people are taught to be cautious interpreters of language functions in the C's argument?
okay, so what do we need to do first?
Find our conclusion.
Yes, what is our conclusion?
um, I was between the first sentence and the second, and that's where maybe I started going wrong.
What is this C person trying to convince us of? What is
Maps are like language. That
maps
they
are like language? I'm like, okay, so maps are like language. I feel like that's okay. They can be manipulated in order to mislead. And so I'm thinking like, okay, so like you can manipulate language, you're also able to manipulate maps.
right.
That most people are not generally misled by words, however, should not lead us to think that most people are not susceptible to being misled by maps.
Right.
Most people are taught to be cautious interpreters of language, but education and the sophisticated use of maps is almost non-existent. So I feel like we can really agree on that this last sentence is a premise, right?
Right. Yeah.
So what are we using this to support?
Mm, I would say that it's I like so like I would think it would support the sentence right before it.
Yeah, that most people are not generally misled by words, however, should not lead us to think that most people are not susceptible to being misled by maps. So they're saying like, hey, just because most people like aren't misled by language doesn't mean that we shouldn't think people aren't misled by maps. So then what part of the argument do you think is this first part then that we were debating between?
Um, so I put it as background
I
information, but
agree. I feel like they're saying this is just this is a possibility, right? Like,
right,
hey, maps are like language, they can be used to manipulate. But then we take this fact to then go on to our conclusion, which is like, hey, you can't just think that people aren't susceptible to maps though, because people aren't taught in school to not be susceptible. Excellent. So whatever we read it on and it says, which of the following most accurately describes how the statement that most people are taught to be cautious interpreter of language. So what did you predict
so
that
I
was doing?
like to me, I was like the way that last sentence is written was like almost a little bit comparative, right? Like a little bit of like
an analogy kind of thing?
almost, yeah, almost. At first I was like, oh, it is an analogy, but like I reread it like literally 5 times, and I'm like, I almost don't like it sounds like an analogy, but I almost feel like it's not really an analogy. It's more like of this, but this kind
Okay.
of thing. So like that's where I was like, okay. But
I
yeah,
feel
like
like it's a fact, right? And we use it almost to say, like, hey, in that situation, this is what happens. Like in this situation, that is true. But we then compare it to our situation.
right.
All right. So let's go ahead and start with A and tell me love it, leave it, or hate it.
That one was such a trick question. That one was such a trick answer. it's offered as an analogical, it was offered as an analogical case that helps to clarify the meaning of the argument's conclusion. At first I did keep it because of the word analogical, which caused me to go read it 5 times again.
Okay. So it is offered as an analogy case that helps to clarify the meaning of the argument's conclusion. So does that statement alone help clarify the argument's conclusion?
No.
I don't like that part of it, but I agree with you. I probably would have if I was taking the test, I would have been kind of like, I'm gonna leave this one for a minute, even though I don't know if it's clarifying the meaning of the argument's conclusion. I'd be very nitpicky of that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go on to B.
It is a conclusion drawn, and then I stopped. And no, I like.
Yeah, it's not a conclusion in any
Right.
way. Excellent.
And then it is part of a distinction drawn in order to support the argument's conclusion. And I did keep that one.
Okay, awesome. Let's leave that one and keep going.
It is offered as support for the contention that maps have certain relevant similarities to language. And I kept that one too.
Okay, so that one, when I like it when it says it is part of a distinction, like I feel like it is part of a distinction between the two different ones, drawn in order to support the argument's conclusion. But do we have to distinct between two, like, do we make the distinction between the two in order to support our conclusion?
Like in that last one?
Yeah, is that like what it's doing there? Like, is part of the distinction drawn? So the distinction drawn is between maps and language, right?
Uh-huh.
Is this distinction drawn here for the pink part? Do we use that do we use that to support our conclusion? The fact that we have to make this distinction between these two things?
I think it does.
I agree. I like C a lot. Wait, were we talking about C and then, yeah, C, right?
Yes.
I got confused for a second. I was like, wait, yeah, I like that too. So I'm like, it's part of the distinction in order to support. It's like, yeah, it is part of the distinction. And what is the distinction? It's that language people are taught this, but in maps they're not taught this. And that distinction supports our conclusion that we can't just assume that people aren't misled by maps.
Right.
All right, so let's go on to D.
It is offered as support for the contention that maps have certain relevant similarities to language. And I kept it, and to be honest, it's because I really didn't know what contention meant.
Oh, so contention is I'm gonna make sure. A contention is like another word for concession. Like an assertion, especially one made in an argument. So the capacity or contention is like what you put forth. So it is offered as support for the contention. So does this fact here support that that maps have similarities to language? No, like this is where we're talking about that they're different, right?
Right.
So this one we easily could have crossed off D just because we know that this sentence here is not talking about similarities between maps and language. This is actually a difference.
I see.
And then I'm guessing you crossed E off pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
So then were you debating between, did you pick D or were you debating between A and C?
I picked D because I was like, I don't know what that means. And yeah.
That's okay. Like you learned that word though. And now it's like, wait, and if you ever really struggle with knowing what a word is, try reading it without the word and feel like what you think it means. Like don't try to fill it in with something else. Just read it without it. And so when it says that, like it is offered as support for the thing that maps have certain relevant similarities to language. Even if we just put that word in with thing or something, for the something that maps have, like I feel like we could even like what I think we could have crossed it off just because we would have focused more then on the meat of the answer choice, which is talking about like the similarities.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then A, it is offered as an analogical case that helps to clarify. Yeah, we don't, and then I would have gone up between A and C and definitely gone with C, but crossed A off just because we're not clarifying the meaning of the argument's conclusion. Like we're just offering support for it. We're not trying to explain what it actually means.
Right.
And so our answer is C.